All right, so picture this. Finland has just shaken off centuries of being under Russian rule and declared its independence in 1917. Things are fresh, but definitely not easy. You're stepping into a country trying to rebuild after the chaos of the Finnish Civil War. Sounds like a pretty intense time, right? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into Finland during the 1920s, a time of political drama, economic recovery, technological growth, and some seriously deep cultural identity stuff. Now, let's talk about the economy. The 1920s weren't exactly smooth sailing. Finland was moving away from being a totally agrarian society, but agriculture still played a huge role in the country's economy. They were trying to industrialize and develop sectors like forestry, textiles, and machinery. At the same time, their economy was heavily reliant on exports, timber, paper products, and metal goods. Finland's big trade partners, Sweden, Germany, and Russia. But let's not sugarcoat things. The aftermath of the Civil War, combined with inflation and a growing national debt, made it hard for the country to get back on its feet. They were definitely facing challenges, but things did start to pick up by the end of the decade, especially in cities like Helsinki and Tampere. And speaking of picking things up, Finland was also getting into technology and innovation during this time. While they were still behind other European countries, they were making strides. Their massive forestry industry was booming, which meant they were producing some of the best timber and paper in Europe. The shipbuilding industry was growing too, which was pretty important for their maritime trade. In terms of tech, Finland was getting into telecommunications and modern machines, though the country was still catching up. But hey, it's the 1920s. It's all about laying the foundation for bigger things later. Of course, no country in the 1920s was without its political drama, and Finland was no exception. They were only a few years out from the Civil War, which had divided the country into two main factions. The White Guard, which was backed by conservatives, and the Red Guard, who were aligned with the socialists. The White Guard came out on top, and the political scene was pretty conservative in the following years. But there was still plenty of tension between the left and the right. At the same time, Finland was focused on securing its independence and developing a functioning democracy. In foreign policy, they had to figure out how to balance relations with both Western powers like Germany and France and their much larger neighbor to the east, the Soviet Union. A tricky situation, for sure. But don't worry, Finland wasn't just all about politics and economic struggles. The 1920s saw a lot of action in the military, too. After the Civil War, Finland knew it needed to get its defense in order. While the country remained neutral, they started reorganizing and modernizing their army, with a focus on preparing for any potential threats from the Soviet Union. They began investing in modern rifles, artillery, and armored vehicles. And the army was structured around a core of well-trained soldiers. Though there wasn't major warfare in the 1920s, all of this military preparedness would come into play a decade later during the Winter War with the Soviet Union. So, while all of this political and military stuff was going on, what was happening with the people of Finland? Well, the social scene in the 1920s was a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, Finland was dealing with the social aftermath of the Civil War. On the other, there were huge changes as the country worked on rebuilding itself. The divide between rural and urban areas was still significant. The countryside was still dominated by agriculture, but cities like Helsinki were turning into industrial hubs. The labor movement grew stronger, with workers fighting for better rights and conditions. And while Finland's parliament slowly began to stabilize, there were still tensions between the left and right-wing factions. Now, when it comes to the welfare system, the 1920s were kind of like the baby steps phase. Healthcare and social programs were in their infancy, and it wasn't easy for rural Finns to get the same level of services as people in the cities. There were efforts to improve healthcare, but it was still a work in progress. Quality of life for many Finns was tough, especially for those working in agriculture. But in cities, industrial jobs offered slightly better conditions. Education was a little better than in some other countries. But poverty and unemployment still loomed large, especially as the Great Depression started to affect Finland by the end of the decade. So, who were the key figures shaping Finland during this time? Well, First up, we have President Carlo Juho Stolberg, the very first president of Finland, who helped steer the country towards a more democratic system. Then we have Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, a military leader who was critical in both the Civil War and later during the Winter War. Politicians like Väinö Tanner, who pushed for welfare reforms and workers' rights, also made an impact. The 1920s were also a time when intellectuals and writers like Väinö Linna started to establish Finnish literature, which would go on to become a key part of the country's cultural identity. Speaking of culture, the 1920s were a time of cultural awakening for Finland. They were building this strong national identity, and you could see it reflected in literature, music, and art. Writers were diving deep into the Finnish national psyche and exploring themes like independence, struggle, and the working class. Artists were embracing the Finnish Art Nouveau movement, which was part of the broader European modernist trend. And then there's music. Composers like Gian Sibelius were gaining international recognition. Even Finnish cinema, though still in its early stages, was starting to find its voice. Finland was starting to really embrace its cultural heritage, with a renewed pride in its independence. And of course, folklore and legends continued to play a big part in shaping Finnish culture. The Kalevala, the epic poem full of ancient myths, was central to the nation's identity, and the concept of sisu, that unshakable resilience, was everywhere. Now, the 1920s weren't all sunshine and rainbows. Finland wasn't immune to political violence. Far-right groups like the Lapua movement tried to make their mark, sometimes resorting to violent tactics. This period also saw a bit of underground resistance from socialists and communists, though their efforts didn't really gain traction. Despite these tensions, Finland didn't see the rise of criminal syndicates or anything too major on the crime front. Finland was predominantly Lutheran, but the 1920s saw some growing secularism, especially as the younger generations turned away from church attendance. Religion was still very important, particularly in rural areas, and the Lutheran Church remained a key cultural institution. However, the country was also seeing the rise of more modernist ideas in the wake of World War I, and that was starting to influence people's spiritual beliefs. Finally, let's talk about a couple of key events. The Treaty of Tartu in 1920 was huge. It marked the end of Finland's war with Soviet Russia and recognized Finland's sovereignty. This was a massive diplomatic win for Finland, securing its borders and confirming its independence. However, things weren't all smooth sailing. The Great Depression towards the end of the decade brought on unemployment, financial instability, and economic hardship. But despite all that, Finland had managed to maintain its independence, and that was a big deal for a country that had just fought so hard to secure it. So, what's the bottom line? The 1920s were a period of intense rebuilding for Finland. It was a time of struggle, but also one of progress. A country fresh off the heels of a brutal civil war, still trying to find its footing politically, economically, and socially. Yet, through it all, Finland was carving out its identity, one defined by resilience, innovation, and a deep connection to its heritage. It wasn't easy, but it laid the groundwork for the strong, independent nation we recognize today. Thanks for tuning in to The World as We Know It and joining me in another chapter of world history. As always, there are more detailed notes in the description, and we welcome any requests or recommendations in the comments section. If you found this video helpful, entertaining, or educational, please consider liking this video and subscribing to support our channel. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.